The battlefield stretched endlessly under the crimson sky of Kepler 442b, littered with the broken remains of both alien and human technology. Smoke rose from countless craters where plasma artillery had torn the Earth apart, and the acrid smell of burned metal and ozone filled the air. In the distance, the towering spires of the Zephyrian occupation force gleamed like silver needles against the horizon, their energy shields shimmering with deadly beauty. Sergeant Marcus Chun crouched behind the twisted wreckage of a human transport, his pulse rifle clutched tightly in his hands. Sweat mixed with dirt and blood on his face, creating muddy streaks that ran down to his jawline. His breathing was controlled despite the chaos around him, a testament to years of military training that had prepared him for everything except what he was about to witness. The Terran Colonial Defense Force had been fighting the Zephyrians for 3 years now, ever since the elegant, crystalline beings had declared humanity an inferior species, unworthy of expansion beyond their home system. The aliens possessed technology that seemed almost magical. Energy weapons that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level, shields that could deflect nuclear strikes, and ships that moved faster than anything humanity had ever conceived. Yet somehow, the war continued. Marcus had joined the TCDF not out of hatred for the Zephyrians, but from a deep sense of duty to protect human colonies. He had grown up on New Eden, a peaceful agricultural world where the biggest concern was usually crop rotation schedules. The day the Zephyrian fleet arrived and glassed half the planet from orbit had changed everything. He had watched his childhood home burn from space, the green fields he had run through as a boy transformed into seas of molten glass. But that was 3 years ago. Now, Marcus had seen enough of war to know that sometimes the greatest enemy was not the one shooting at you from across no man's land. Chun. The voice belonged to Colonel Thaddeus Rains, a man whose reputation preceded him like a toxic cloud. Rains was known throughout the TCDF for his aggressive tactics and his complete disregard for what military regulations quaintly called collateral damage. He was also known for something else. His belief that humanity could only win this war by becoming more ruthless than their enemies. Marcus turned to see Rains approaching, flanked by 2 of his personal guards. The colonel was a tall, imposing figure with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they looked upon. His uniform was pristine despite the battlefield conditions, maintained by a personal aide who followed him everywhere with cleaning supplies and a portable pressing unit. "Sir," Marcus responded, snapping to attention despite his exhaustion. Military protocol was deeply ingrained in him, even when he disagreed with the person demanding it. "I have new orders for your squad," Rains said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. He gestured toward a cluster of structures about 2 kilometers to the east, barely visible through the smoke and haze. "Intelligence indicates there's a Zephyrian civilian evacuation center in that complex. Families, mostly. Children, elderly, non-combatants who thought they were safe behind their lines." Marcus felt a cold sensation creep up his spine. In 3 years of fighting, he had never been asked to target civilians deliberately. The Zephyrians might consider humans inferior, but they were still living beings with families, hopes, and fears. The thought of deliberately targeting non-combatants went against everything he had been taught about honorable warfare. "What are the orders regarding the evacuation center, sir?" Marcus asked, though he already dreaded the answer. Rain smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. It was the smile of a predator who had cornered its prey. "You're going to eliminate every living thing in that complex. Every last one of them. The Zephyrians need to understand that we can be just as ruthless as they are. Perhaps more so." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around him, he could hear the other members of his squad shifting uncomfortably. Private Johnson, barely 19 years old and still homesick for his family farm on Kepler, 186F, made a small sound of distress. Corporal Williams, a veteran of the Proxima Centauri campaign, stared at the ground with the hollow expression of someone who had seen too much already. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "targeting non-combatants is against the Geneva Conventions, the Tau Ceti Accords, and TCDF regulations." "I'm not sure, Sergeant," Rains interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The Geneva Conventions don't apply to alien species, and the Tau Ceti Accord were signed before we knew we were fighting for the survival of our entire species. As for TCDF regulations, I am giving you a direct order. You will follow it, or you will be court-martialed for disobedience in the face of the enemy. Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the gravity of a gas giant. He thought about his sister Sarah, who worked as a teacher in the human refugee camps. She had dedicated her life to protecting and educating the children who had lost their homes to this war. What would she think if she knew he was being ordered to murder alien children? What would his parents think, the same people who had raised him with stories of human heroes who stood up for what was right even when it was difficult? The weak must be eliminated, Colonel Rains continued, his voice growing louder so that nearby soldiers could hear him. The Zephyrians see mercy as weakness, and weakness invites destruction. If we want to win this war, we must be willing to do what they will not expect. We must be willing to cross lines they think we're too civilized to cross. The colonel turned to address not just Marcus's squad, but the dozens of other soldiers who had gathered within earshot. His voice carried the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to giving speeches that would send others to their deaths. For too long, we have fought this war with one hand tied behind our backs, Rains declared. We have followed rules of engagement that the enemy ignores. We have shown mercy to those who would show us none. Today, that changes. Today, we show the Zephyrians that humanity can be just as ruthless as any species in the galaxy. Marcus looked around at the faces of his fellow soldiers. Some seemed convinced by the colonel's words, nodding grimly, as if they had been waiting for someone to give them permission to abandon their humanity. Others looked sick, their faces pale with the realization of what they were being asked to do. A few seemed caught in the middle, torn between their training to follow orders and their conscience telling them this was wrong. Private Johnson raised his hand tentatively. Sir, what if some of the civilians surrender? What if they're clearly non-threatening? Rains' expression darkened. There are no non-threatening Zephyrians, Private. They're all part of a species that seeks to exterminate us. Their children will grow up to pilot the ships that glass our worlds. Their elderly are the ones who voted to declare us unworthy of existence. There will be no prisoners, no exceptions, no mercy. The words hung in the air like a toxic gas, poisoning the atmosphere around them. Marcus felt something inside him recoil at the colonel's reasoning. Yes, the Zephyrians had committed terrible acts against humanity. Yes, this was a war for survival. But the moment they abandoned their principles, the moment they became willing to murder innocents, what would they be fighting to preserve? Eliminate the weak, Rains commanded, his voice rising to a shout that carried across the battlefield. That is your order, and you will carry it out. Sergeant Shun, you will lead the assault on the evacuation center. I want it completed within 2 hours, and I want confirmation that nothing inside survived. Marcus felt the eyes of his squad upon him, waiting for his response. He thought about the chain of command, about military discipline, about the consequences of disobedience. He thought about his career, his future, his standing among his peers. Then he thought about the children in that evacuation center, alien or not, who were probably huddled together in fear, hoping that someone would protect them from the war raging outside their walls. The decision crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. There were some orders that no moral person could follow, regardless of the consequences. There were some lines that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The moment he agreed to deliberately murder civilians, he would become something he could never live with being. Marcus straightened to his full height and looked Colonel Rains directly in the eyes. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying to every soldier within hearing range. No, sir. The simple words fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled troops. Colonel Rains' face went through several distinct expressions in rapid succession: surprise, disbelief, and, finally, a cold, calculating anger that made the air around him seem to drop several degrees. What did you say, Sergeant? Rains asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I said no, sir, Marcus replied, never breaking eye contact. I will not lead an assault on a civilian evacuation center. I will not order my men to murder noncombatants. And I will not follow an order that violates every principle this military is supposed to stand for. The battlefield around them seemed to hold its breath. Even the distant sounds of artillery fire seemed to fade into the background as everyone present realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A non-commissioned officer was directly refusing an order from a full colonel in front of dozens of witnesses in the middle of a combat zone. Colonel Rains' hand moved slowly toward the sidearm, holstered at his hip. Sergeant Shun, you are relieved of command pending court-martial for insubordination and cowardice in the face of the enemy. Guards, arrest this man. But the two guards flanking Rains hesitated. They looked uncertain, glancing between their commanding officer and the sergeant who had just taken a stand that many of them secretly admired. In that moment of hesitation, Marcus saw something he had not expected out. Even among Rain's hand-picked supporters, there were those who recognized the moral line that was being crossed. With all due respect, sir, Corporal Williams stepped forward, placing himself beside Marcus. Sergeant Shun is right. This isn't what we signed up for. This isn't what humanity should be. Nor me, Private Johnson added, his voice shaking but determined. I didn't leave my family's farm to become a murderer of children. One by one, other members of Marcus's squad stepped forward to stand with him. Then, soldiers from other units began to join them. What had started as one man's refusal was rapidly becoming something much larger, a rebellion of conscience in the middle of a war zone. Colonel Rain's face was now flushed with rage, his carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. "This is mutiny," he shouted. "I'll have every last one of you shot for treason." "No," Marcus said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the tense air. "This is humanity." The confrontation had reached a critical point, with dozens of soldiers choosing sides and the entire operation hanging in the balance. In the distance, the Zephyrian evacuation center continued to shelter innocent lives, unaware that their fate was being decided by a debate about the soul of the human species. Colonel Rains drew his sidearm, pointing it directly at Marcus's chest. "You have 10 seconds to retract your refusal and follow orders, Sergeant. If you don't, I'll execute you for treason and find someone else to complete the mission." Marcus looked down the barrel of the weapon and felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had made his choice, and regardless of the consequences, he knew it was the right one. Some things were worth dying for, and protecting innocent life, even alien life, was one of them. "I stand by my refusal, sir," Marcus said calmly. "If that makes me a traitor in your eyes, so be it. But I won't be a murderer." The sound of Colonel Rains charging his weapon seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out across the battlefield, a reminder that life continued even in the midst of death and destruction. Marcus closed his eyes and thought about his sister Sarah, hoping she would understand why he had chosen to die rather than compromise his principles. But the shot, when it came, was not what anyone expected. The energy blast struck Colonel Rains squarely in the chest, sending him flying backward into the twisted metal wreckage of a destroyed armored vehicle. His weapon clattered across the scarred ground as his body hit the debris with a sickening thud. For a moment, the entire battlefield fell into stunned silence, the only sound the crackling of energy dissipating from whatever had fired the shot. Marcus opened his eyes to see a figure emerging from behind a pile of rubble 50 meters away. The newcomer was tall and slender, moving with an almost liquid grace that seemed impossible given the rough terrain. As the figure drew closer, Marcus realized with shock that it was a Zephyrian, but unlike any he had seen before. Most Zephyrians he had encountered were soldiers, encased in their crystalline armor that made them look more like walking sculptures than living beings. This one wore simple robes that shifted color with each step, cycling through deep blues and purples that seemed to capture and reflect the alien sunlight. Its face was visible, revealing the strange beauty that characterized its species, features that were both angular and flowing, with large eyes that held an intelligence that was undeniably sentient. The alien approached slowly, its hands raised in what Marcus hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression. When it spoke, its voice carried a musical quality that seemed to resonate in frequencies just at the edge of human hearing. "I am Veltar of the Resonance Caste," the Zephyrian said in accented but clear standard human. "I witnessed your exchange with your war leader. Your choice to protect innocents, even those not of your species, is unexpected." Marcus found himself at a loss for words. In 3 years of fighting, he had never heard a Zephyrian speak in anything other than the clipped, military communications that were occasionally intercepted by human intelligence. To hear one speaking conversationally, acknowledging the moral weight of the situation, was profoundly disorienting. "You shot our commanding officer," Corporal Williams observed, his weapon half-raised but not quite pointing at the alien. The confusion in his voice reflected what they all felt. Were they supposed to treat this as an enemy combatant or something else entirely? "I prevented on execution," Veltar corrected gently. Your leader would have killed this warrior for refusing to commit atrocities. Such an action would have been regrettable for multiple reasons. The alien moved closer, and Marcus could see that it carried no visible weapons. Its robes seemed to shimmer with some kind of technological integration, but nothing that appeared threatening. Around them, the human soldiers remained in a state of tense uncertainty, unsure whether they should be fighting, talking, or calling for backup. "Why?" Marcus asked, finally finding his voice. "Why would you care what happened to human soldiers? Your people have been trying to exterminate us for 3 years." Veltar paused, its large eyes studying Marcus with an intensity that was somehow both alien and familiar. When it spoke again, its voice carried what sounded almost like sadness. "That is not entirely accurate, though I understand why you would believe it to be so. The conflict between our species began because of decisions made by those who believe that different means inferior. But not all Zephyrians share this view, just as not all humans apparently share your war leader's willingness to target civilians." The implications of this statement began to sink in. Marcus had always assumed that the war was a simple matter of species survival, us against them, with no middle ground possible. The idea that there might be factions within Zephyrian society, some of whom opposed the war, was revolutionary. "Are you saying there are Zephyrians who don't want this war?" Private Johnson asked, stepping forward despite his obvious fear. His youth made him more willing to consider possibilities that hardened veterans might dismiss. "Many of us question the wisdom of the High Assembly's decision," Veltar confirmed. "The Resonance Caste, in particular, has long believed that diversity of thought and culture strengthens rather than weakens the galaxy. We study other species not to determine their worthiness, but to understand the different perspectives they bring to existence." A groan from behind them reminded everyone that Colonel Rains was still alive, though clearly injured. The energy blast had been precisely calibrated, enough to incapacitate without killing. Marcus found this restraint remarkable, especially given that the alien had just witnessed Rains ordering the massacre of Zephyrian civilians. "We need to get medical attention for the colonel," Marcus said, his training overriding his personal feelings about the man. "Whatever else he is, he's a wounded human soldier." Veltar nodded approvingly. "Your compassion extends even to those who would compromise your principles. This is why some of us believe humanity deserves consideration rather than extermination." As if summoned by their conversation, a TCDF medical team arrived on the scene, having been drawn by reports of weapons fire in the command area. The medics immediately went to work on Colonel Rains, their training taking over despite their confusion about the presence of an unrestrained Zephyrian in their midst. "Sergeant," one of the medics called out, "what's the situation here? Why isn't that alien secured?" Marcus looked around at his fellow soldiers, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. Military protocol demanded that any enemy combatant be detained immediately. But Veltar had just saved his life, and, more importantly, had revealed the possibility that this war might be more complex than anyone had realized. "The alien is under my personal supervision," Marcus said finally, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. "It appears to be a non-combatant with information relevant to our mission." Veltar observed this exchange with what Marcus was beginning to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of amusement. "Your command structures are remarkably rigid, yet you display considerable individual initiative when circumstances require it. This adaptability may be one of humanity's greatest strengths, or greatest weaknesses, depending on your perspective," Corporal Williams muttered. "Chain of command exists for a reason." "Indeed," Veltar agreed. "But when the chain of command leads toward actions that violate fundamental moral principles, individual conscience becomes the final arbiter of right and wrong. This is a concept that the High Assembly has difficulty understanding." The medical team finished stabilizing Colonel Rains and prepared to evacuate him to the field hospital. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, his eyes focused enough to recognize what was happening around him. When he saw Veltar standing freely among the human soldiers, his face contorted with rage. "Arrest that thing," he shouted weakly, trying to raise himself from the stretcher. "It's an enemy combatant. Chun, if you don't secure that alien immediately, I'll have you shot for treason. The medics tried to calm him down, but Rains continued his tirade even as they carried him away. His threats and accusations echoed across the battlefield, a reminder that the moral choice Marcus had made would have consequences that extended far beyond this moment. Your war leader seems persistent in his hostility, Veltar observed once Rains was out of earshot. This presents complications for any attempt at dialogue between our species. Colonel Rains represents one view of how this war should be fought, Marcus said carefully. But he doesn't represent all of humanity, just as you apparently don't represent all Zephyrians. A diplomatic answer, Veltar noted approvingly. You would do well in the resonance cast. We value those who can see multiple perspectives simultaneously. Private Johnson, who had been listening to the exchange with growing excitement, suddenly spoke up. If there are Zephyrians who don't want this war, why don't they just stop fighting? Why don't they talk to humans who feel the same way? Veltar's expression, or what passed for expression in the alien facial structure, became more serious. The same reason your Sergeant Chen nearly faced execution for refusing an immoral order. Those who question the dominant narrative are often labeled as traitors. In Zephyrian society, the penalty for such treachery is permanent death. Marcus asked, Urs Veltar replied. Consciousness dissolution. The individual ceases to exist not just physically, but as a pattern of thought and memory. It is considered the ultimate punishment because it erases not just the person, but any influence they might have had on others. The humans fell silent as they contemplated this revelation. The idea of punishment that extended beyond death, that could erase someone's very existence from the universe, was horrifying in its thoroughness. It also explained why opposition to the war might be limited among Zephyrians. Few beings would risk such total obliteration. Yet you're here talking to us, Corporal Williams pointed out. You're risking that punishment right now. Because some things are worth the risk, Veltar said simply. Your sergeant understood this when he refused to murder civilians. I understand it now. Watching beings I was taught to consider inferior display moral courage that exceeds what I've seen in many of my own kind. A new voice interrupted their conversation. Sergeant Shun, report your status immediately. Marcus turned to see Major Patricia Hawkins approaching with a squad of military police. Hawkins was known as a by-the-book officer, someone who followed regulations with religious devotion. Her presence suggested that word of the confrontation with Colonel Rains had already reached higher command levels. Major, Marcus said, snapping to attention. I'm afraid the situation here is complicated. Hawkins's eyes moved from Marcus to the Zephyrian standing calmly among the human soldiers. Her hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, but she didn't draw it. Years of military training warred with the obvious fact that if the alien had wanted to harm anyone, it could have done so already. I can see that, she said dryly. I've just received word that Colonel Rains was found wounded and is claiming that you disobeyed a direct order and collaborated with enemy forces. Care to explain? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would likely determine the course of the rest of his life. He could try to minimize what had happened, claim that he was following some obscure regulation that prohibited targeting civilians. He could blame the stress of combat, temporary confusion, any number of excuses that might provide some protection. Instead, he chose honesty. Colonel Rains ordered me to lead an assault on a Zephyrian civilian evacuation center, Marcus said clearly. The order was to eliminate all occupants, including non-combatants. I refused to follow an order that violated the laws of war and basic human decency. When the colonel threatened to execute me for disobedience, this Zephyrian intervened to prevent what would have been a war crime. Major Hawkins blinked slowly, processing the implications of Marcus's statement. Around them, the military police shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about how to handle a situation that no training manual had prepared them for. And you're claiming this alien acted to protect you? Hawkins asked, her voice carefully neutral. Not just protect me, Marcus replied. Veltar here represents a faction within Zephyrian society that opposes the war. Its presence suggests that this conflict might not be as simple as we've been led to believe. It speaks, Hawkins asked, looking directly at Veltar for the first time. I do, Veltar confirmed, its musical voice causing several of the military police to step back in surprise. I also think, feel, hope, and fear much as you do. The differences between our species may be less significant than the similarities. Major Hawkins stared at the alien for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Marcus could see her mind working, trying to fit this unprecedented situation into the framework of military regulations and strategic priorities. Finally, she made a decision that surprised everyone present. "I'm going to need a full debriefing from all parties involved," she announced. "Sergeant Chun, you and your squad will accompany me to headquarters for immediate questioning. As for you," she addressed Veltar directly, "I don't suppose you'd be willing to continue this conversation under more formal circumstances." "I would be honored to do so," Veltar replied, "though I should warn you that my presence here was not authorized by my superiors. In speaking with you, I may have already committed what they would consider treason." "Then, we have something in common," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe that's where peace talks should start, with the people both sides consider traitors." Major Hawkins looked between the human sergeant and the alien diplomat, both of whom had risked everything to take a stand for their principles. In the distance, the sounds of war continued, but for the first time in 3 years, there was a possibility that those sounds might not continue forever. "I think," she said slowly, "that we need to contact Fleet Command immediately. This situation has escalated beyond anything I'm authorized to handle." As they prepared to leave the battlefield, Marcus caught himself looking back at the Zephyrin evacuation center that Colonel Rains had ordered him to destroy. It still stood intact, its occupants unaware of how close they had come to tragedy. Whatever consequences awaited him for his choice, he knew he would face them without regret. The TCDF headquarters on Kepler 442b was a massive underground complex carved in the planet's bedrock, designed to withstand orbital bombardment and continue operations even under siege. Marcus had been there twice before, both times for routine briefings that had lasted less than an hour. Now, as he walked through its sterile corridors flanked by armed guards, he suspected his stay would be considerably longer. The debriefing room was stark and windowless, lit by harsh white panels that cast everything in sharp relief. A single metal table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by uncomfortable chairs that seemed designed to encourage quick confessions. Veltar sat across from Marcus, its colorful robes providing the only splash of warmth in the cold environment. "This is highly irregular," Admiral Sarah Morrison said as she entered the room, followed by a small army of aides, intelligence officers, and legal advisors. Morrison was the commanding officer for the entire Kepler 442b operation, a woman whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her absolute adherence to military protocol. Marcus rose to attention, but Morrison waved him back down with an impatient gesture. Her eyes were focused entirely on Veltar, studying the alien with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that could determine the fate of millions. "Admiral," Veltar said, rising gracefully and executing what appeared to be a formal bow, "I am honored by your presence, though I suspect my own presence here is causing considerable disruption to your normal procedures." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at the alien's fluency and diplomatic courtesy. "You could say that. In 40 years of military service, I've never had to figure out how to handle an enemy combatant who claims to be a peace envoy while simultaneously being wanted for treason by his own government. A situation that illustrates the complexity of the current conflict," Veltar replied smoothly. "Perhaps it is time to acknowledge that this war has created complications that traditional military thinking cannot address." "Maybe," Morrison said, taking a seat across from the alien. "But before we get into the politics of the situation, I need to understand exactly what happened on that battlefield. Sergeant Chun, I want your account of events, starting from when you received your orders from Colonel Rains." Marcus had rehearsed this moment during the long walk to headquarters, knowing that his words would be analyzed by intelligence experts looking for any sign of deception or collaboration with the enemy. He told the truth clearly and completely, from Rains' order to massacre civilians through the confrontation that had nearly cost him his life. When he finished, Morrison turned to her intelligence advisor, a thin man with calculating eyes who had been taking notes throughout Marcus's account. "Major Kim, what's your assessment?" "Sergeant Chen's story is consistent with reports from other soldiers who witnessed the events," Kim replied. "We've also reviewed Colonel Rains' medical records. The energy weapon that incapacitated him was set to precisely the right level to neutralize without causing permanent damage. That level of restraint suggests either remarkable marksmanship or advanced understanding of human physiology. Veltarspuke upequeitly. The resonance cast has studied many species over the millennia. We understand that knowledge should be used to preserve life, not destroy it. Morrison leaned forward, her expression intent. Tell me about this resonance cast. How much influence does it have within Zephyrian society? We are scholars, diplomats, and philosophers, Veltar explained. We seek to understand rather than to conquer. Unfortunately, we have limited political power compared to the Dominion caste, which controls military affairs, or the Synthesis caste, which manages economic and technological development. But you exist, Morrison pressed. There are Zephyrians who oppose this war. Many more than you might imagine, Veltar confirmed. The decision to declare humanity unworthy was controversial even within the High Assembly. It passed by a narrow margin, and only because the Dominion caste claimed that humans posed an existential threat to Zephyrian expansion. Marcus found himself leaning forward despite his exhaustion. This was the first time he had heard any explanation for why the war had started beyond the simple narrative of alien aggression that had driven human resistance efforts. What kind of threat, he asked. Humans hadn't even encountered Zephyrians before you attacked our colonies. Veltar's expression grew troubled. That is precisely why the Dominion caste considered you dangerous. Humanity's rapid technological advancement and expansion into space occurred without any guidance or oversight from established galactic civilizations. Your species developed independently, creating technologies and social structures that did not follow expected patterns. And that was threatening? Morrison asked incredulously. To those who believe in rigid hierarchies and predetermined development paths, yes, Veltar replied. The Dominion caste has spent thousands of years creating a galactic order where each species has its place and function. Humanity represented chaos, a species that might inspire others to break free from established constraints. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. The war that had cost millions of lives and devastated dozens of worlds had not been fought over resources or territory, but because humanity's very existence challenged an alien concept of cosmic order. So we're fighting for the right to be ourselves, Marcus said slowly. The right to develop our own technology, explore our own space, make our own mistakes. More than that, Veltar said. You are fighting for the principle that sentient beings should be free to determine their own destiny, rather than having their fate decided by others who consider themselves superior. This principle threatens the foundation of current galactic civilization. Admiral Morrison exchanged glances with her advisors, and Marcus could see wheels turning behind her eyes. This was intelligence that could change the entire strategic picture of the war if it was accurate. Why should we believe you? Major Kim asked bluntly. This could be an elaborate deception designed to make us lower our guard or reveal military secrets. Veltar considered this question seriously before responding. You should not believe me based on my word alone, but consider what I have already demonstrated. I prevented the execution of one of your soldiers, revealed information about internal Zephyrian politics that your intelligence services had not discovered, and placed myself at considerable risk to open dialogue between our species. If this were deception, what would be its purpose? To lure our weaknesses, Kim replied immediately. To identify humans who might be willing to collaborate, to spread dissension among our forces. Your forces are already experiencing dissension, Veltar pointed out gently. Sergeant Chin's refusal to follow an immoral order was not an isolated incident. I have observed similar conflicts among human military personnel on other battlefields. Your greatest weakness is not external opposition, but internal disagreement about what methods are acceptable in pursuit of victory. Morrison slammed her hand on the table, the sharp sound echoing in the confined space. Enough philosophical discussion. Here's what I need to know. Are there Zephyrians who would be willing to negotiate an end to this war? Yes, Veltar replied without hesitation. But they would need assurance that humanity is capable of coexisting with other species rather than simply replacing Zephyrian dominance with human dominance. What kind of assurance? Marcus asked. Demonstration that humans can choose mercy over vengeance, even when vengeance would be easier, Veltar said, looking directly at him. Your choice on the battlefield was exactly such a demonstration. By refusing to massacre civilians, You proved that humanity is capable of restraint even under extreme pressure. Morrison stood up abruptly and began pacing, her mind clearly working through complex strategic calculations. This is bigger than one battlefield incident. If what you're saying is true, we might be looking at the possibility of splitting the Zephyrian alliance. Some groups supporting continued war, others favoring negotiation. Precisely, Veltor confirma. But such a split would require human cooperation. The Resonance Cast cannot argue for peace if humanity continues to demonstrate that it is willing to commit atrocities in the name of victory. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield fire. Marcus realized that his decision to refuse Colonel Rain's order had consequences that extended far beyond his own fate. By choosing to protect alien civilians, he had potentially opened a path toward peace that no one had previously imagined. "We need to contact Fleet Command," Morrison said finally. "This situation requires decisions at the highest level of government." "Admiral," Marcus said quietly, "what happens to my squad? They stood with me when I refused the order. They shouldn't be punished for my decision." Morrison looked at him with something that might have been respect. "Sergeant, if what we've learned here today leads to a peaceful resolution to this war, your squad will probably receive medals rather than court-martials. If it doesn't," she shrugged, "well, we'll all have bigger problems to worry about." A young lieutenant entered the room and whispered something in Morrison's ear. Her expression grew grim as she listened, and Marcus felt his stomach clench with dread. "It seems Colonel Rains has recovered sufficiently to file formal charges," Morrison announced. "He's demanding that you be arrested for treason, mutiny, and collaboration with enemy forces. He's also calling for the immediate execution of our alien guest here." Veltar showed no visible reaction to this news, but Marcus could see a subtle shift in its posture that suggested increased alertness. "I expected this development. The question now is whether your command structure will prioritize military discipline over the possibility of peace." Morrison studied both Marcus and Veltar for a long moment before making a decision that would echo through military history. "Colonel Rains is entitled to file his charges, but I'm the commanding officer for this sector, and I'm exercising my authority to classify this entire incident under special intelligence protocols. That means all formal proceedings are suspended pending review by Fleet Command and the civilian government." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Marcus asked. "It means you're not under arrest, but you're not exactly free either," Morrison replied. "You and your squad will remain in protective custody while we sort out the larger implications. As for you," she addressed Veltar, "I'm granting you temporary diplomatic immunity pending formal review of your status." "You have the authority to do that?" Major Kim asked, clearly surprised by Morrison's boldness. "I have the authority to take any action necessary to protect vital intelligence assets," Morrison replied firmly. "And, right now, both Sergeant Shun and Veltar represent intelligence of the highest possible value." As guards arrived to escort them to more comfortable quarters, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had avoided immediate execution or imprisonment, but the larger consequences of his actions were still unfolding. Veltar had opened a door to the possibility of peace, but walking through that door would require changes in thinking that might prove impossible for either species. "Sergeant," Veltar said quietly as they walked through the corridors, "you should know that your choices already had consequences beyond this facility. Word of a human soldier refusing to massacre civilians is spreading through covert networks within the Resonance Cast. For the first time in years, there is hope that this war might end through negotiation rather than total destruction." "And if the negotiations fail?" Marcus asked. "Then we will have learned something valuable about both our species," Veltar replied. "And perhaps those who survive will be better prepared for the next opportunity to choose peace over war." The weight of representing not just his own principles, but possibly the future of human-Zephyrian relations, settled on Marcus's shoulders like lead armor. He had made a choice to protect innocent life, never imagining that it would place him at the center of the most important diplomatic development in human history. The secure communication chamber deep within TCDF headquarters hummed with activity as technicians established an encrypted connection to Fleet Command on Earth. Marcus stood at attention beside Veltar, both of them waiting to participate in what would likely be the most important conversation in human history. Admiral Morrison paced nervously nearby, reviewing her notes one final time before presenting their case to the highest levels of human government. "Connection established," announced the communications officer. "Fleet Admiral Zhang is standing by, along with Secretary of Defense Williams and President Martinez." The main screen flickered to life, revealing three faces that Marcus recognized from news broadcasts but had never expected to address personally. Fleet Admiral Zhang was a weathered veteran whose strategic brilliance had kept human forces operational despite overwhelming technological disadvantages. Secretary Williams had the calculating look of someone accustomed to weighing impossible choices. President Martinez appeared tired, bearing the weight of leading humanity through its first interstellar war. "Admiral Morrison," President Martinez said without preamble, "we've read your preliminary report, but frankly, it's so extraordinary that we need to hear the details directly from the people involved. We have less than 6 hours before the Joint Chiefs meet to plan our response to the latest Zephyrian offensive. If there's any possibility of a diplomatic solution, we need to know now." Morrison stepped forward. "Madam President, I present Sergeant Marcus Chun, TCDF, and Veltar of the Zephyrian Resonance Cast. Their interaction on the battlefield has revealed information that could fundamentally change our understanding of this war." Marcus felt the weight of three of the most powerful people in human space studying him through the screen. When President Martinez spoke directly to him, he fought to keep his voice steady. "Sergeant Chun, we understand you refused a direct order from a superior officer. In wartime, that's typically grounds for execution. Explain your reasoning." "Madam President," Marcus began, "Colonel Rains ordered my squad to assault a civilian evacuation center with instructions to eliminate all occupants, including non-combatants. I felt that following such an order would violate the laws of war and our fundamental humanity. And you're prepared to face the consequences of that refusal?" Secretary Williams asked. "Yes, sir. Some principles are worth dying for." Fleet Admiral Zhang leaned forward, his expression intense. "What happened next is where your report becomes difficult to believe, Admiral Morrison. You're telling us that a Zephyrian intervened to save the life of a human soldier." Veltar stepped into view of the camera, its presence causing visible surprise on the faces of the human leadership. When it spoke, its melodious voice carried clearly through the communication system. "Honored leaders of humanity, I intervened because I witnessed a being choose moral courage over personal safety. Such choices deserve protection, regardless of the species making them." President Martinez stared at the screen in obvious shock. "You can speak. You can reason. You're not the mindless aggressors our intelligence reports described. I assure you, Madam President, that Zephyrians possess consciousness, emotion, and moral reasoning comparable to your own," Veltar replied. "The assumption that we are mindless aggressors is one of many misunderstandings that have perpetuated this tragic conflict." Secretary Williams interrupted, his voice sharp with suspicion. "How do we know this isn't an elaborate deception? How do we know you're not here to gather intelligence or spread disinformation?" Veltar considered the question carefully before responding. "You do not know, and you should not trust me based on words alone. But consider what I have already revealed: the existence of political factions within Zephyrian society, opposition to the war among significant portions of our population, and, most importantly, the true reason this conflict began." "Which is?" Fleet Admiral Zhang demanded. "The Dominion caste declare humanity a threat not because of your military capabilities, but because of your independence," Veltar explained. "Your species developed space travel, artificial intelligence, and other advanced technologies without following the prescribed patterns that govern galactic civilization. This represents a challenge to the established order that some in power found intolerable." The silence that followed this revelation lasted for nearly a minute. Marcus could see the human leaders processing the implications of what they had just learned. If Veltar was telling the truth, the war was being fought not over territory or resources, but over humanity's right to exist as an independent civilization. "You're saying we're fighting for the right to be free," President Martinez said slowly. "The right to develop according to our own nature rather than some alien template." "More than that," Veltar replied. "You are fighting for the principle that sentient beings should determine their own destiny. If humanity is forced to conform to existing galactic patterns, It sets a precedent that could affect countless other species throughout the galaxy. Fleet Admiral Zhang's expression had grown thoughtful. You mentioned factions within your society. How significant is the opposition to this war? Larger than your intelligence services have detected, Veltar admitted. The Resonance caste has always opposed the conflict, but we have been joined by increasing numbers from other castes who question the wisdom of attempting to destroy a species that poses no direct threat to Zephyrian survival. What would it take to bring these factions to the negotiating table? Secretary Williams asked. Demonstration that humanity is capable of restraint and coexistence, Veltar replied immediately. The Dominion caste has argued that humans are inherently aggressive and expansionist, that they will eventually threaten all other species if allowed to continue their independent development. Sergeant Chen's choice to protect civilians rather than follow orders for massacre provides evidence to the contrary. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the full implications of what Veltar was saying. His decision on the battlefield had not just been a personal moral choice. It had become a test case for humanity's fitness to survive as an independent species. What specific actions would demonstrate this restraint? President Martinez asked. Several possibilities exist, Veltar said. Establishment of formal rules of engagement that protect non-combatants, punishment of officers who order war crimes, public commitment to post-war coexistence rather than revenge against Zephyrian populations. Most importantly, willingness to negotiate in good faith rather than demanding unconditional surrender. Admiral Morrison stepped forward. Madam President, there's another factor to consider. Colonel Rains is filing formal charges against Sergeant Shun for refusing his order. How we handle those charges will send a clear signal about whether humanity truly values the principles Veltar is describing. The President's expression grew troubled. Sergeant Shun, do you understand the position your actions have put us in? If we support your refusal to follow orders, we risk undermining military discipline in the middle of a war. If we don't, we potentially lose the most significant opportunity for peace that we've encountered. Understand, Madam President, Marcus replied. I made my choice knowing there will be consequences. I'm prepared to accept whatever decision you make. Fleet Admiral Zhang spoke up suddenly. Veltar, if we were to pursue negotiations, what would happen to you? You've admitted that your presence here constitutes treason by your government standards. The Dominion caste would certainly demand my execution if I returned to Zephyrian space, Veltar acknowledged. But the cause of peace is worth such risks. If negotiations succeed, perhaps the concept of treason for seeking understanding between species will become obsolete. And if they fail? Secretary Williams pressed. Then I will have died attempting something worthwhile, rather than living in complicity with unnecessary destruction. The human leaders exchanged glances, and Marcus could see them weighing military necessity against moral principle, immediate tactical advantages against long-term strategic possibilities. The fate of two species hung in the balance of their decision. Admiral Morrison, President Martinez said finally, I'm authorizing you to establish a formal diplomatic protocol for continued discussions with Veltar. Secretary Williams will coordinate with the State Department to develop a framework for potential negotiations. Fleet Admiral Zhang, I want you to prepare preliminary ceasefire proposals that could serve as a foundation for peace talks. What about Colonel Rain's charges? Admiral Morrison asked. The President was quiet for a long moment before responding. Sergeant Shun, by regulation, I should order your court-martial for disobeying a direct order from a superior officer. However, given the extraordinary circumstances and the potential implications for peace, I'm issuing a presidential pardon for any charges related to your refusal to attack civilians. Furthermore, I'm recommending you for the Medal of Honor for moral courage under fire. Marcus felt his legs nearly give out from relief and shock. He had expected imprisonment or execution, not a presidential pardon, and the highest military honor his country could bestow. Thank you, Madam President, he managed to say. Don't thank me yet, Martinez replied grimly. This is just the beginning. You and Veltar have opened a door to peace, but walking through it will require both species to change in ways that many will find threatening. There will be those on both sides who prefer war to the uncertainty of coexistence. As if summoned by her words, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. The communications officer's voice cut through the noise with urgent authority. Admiral Morrison, We're receiving reports of a massive Zephyrian fleet movement toward the Proxima Centauri system. Initial estimates suggest this could be the largest offensive force we've encountered. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Marcus realized that word of Veltar's presence at human headquarters had somehow reached the Dominion caste, and they were responding with overwhelming force to prevent any possibility of negotiation. It appears, Veltar said quietly, that we are about to discover whether the desire for peace is stronger than the momentum of war. The screen flickered as the connection to Earth was momentarily disrupted by interference from the approaching fleet. When the image stabilized, President Martinez's expression had hardened into the mask of a wartime leader. Admiral Morrison, you are authorized to take any action necessary to protect Veltar and continue diplomatic efforts. If the Dominion caste wants to prevent peace through force, they'll find that humanity is prepared to fight for the right to choose our own destiny. As the communication ended and alerts continued to sound throughout the facility, Marcus realized that their small moment of hope had triggered a crisis that would determine whether two species could learn to coexist or whether they would destroy each other in an escalating cycle of violence and revenge. The Zephyrian assault fleet materialized out of hyperspace like a constellation of deadly stars, their crystalline hulls catching and refracting the light from Kepler 442b's sun into prismatic rainbows that belied their destructive purpose. From the observation deck of the underground command center, Marcus watched the tactical displays with growing dread as more and more enemy ships appeared on the sensors. 247 confirmed vessels, the tactical officer reported, her voice tight with barely controlled fear, including 6 Dominion-class dreadnoughts. This is 3 times larger than any force we've faced before. Admiral Morrison stood beside Marcus and Veltar, her expression grim as she studied the formation of the approaching fleet. They're not positioning for orbital bombardment, she observed. This looks like an invasion force. Veltar's normally composed demeanor had shifted to something approaching distress. This is War Master Thexgar's personal fleet. He is the most aggressive advocate for human extermination within the Dominion caste. My presence here must have been reported, and he has come to ensure that no possibility of peace survives. Can you communicate with them? Morrison asked. Try to open dialogue? Thexgar would consider any communication from me to be further proof of treason, Veltar replied sadly. He believes that the only acceptable outcome is the complete eradication of human civilization. Even speaking to him would accomplish nothing except to provide him with the satisfaction of my capture. The lights dimmed momentarily as the facility's power grid adjusted to support the defensive systems coming online. Throughout the complex, Marcus could hear the sounds of soldiers running to battle stations, weapons being charged, and evacuation protocols being initiated. The peaceful moment they had shared with the possibility of diplomacy was dissolving into the harsh reality of renewed warfare. Admiral, the communications officer called out, we're receiving a transmission from the Zephyrian fleet. They're demanding the immediate surrender of all human forces and the delivery of what they call the traitor who corrupts both species with false hope. Morrison's jaw tightened. Send a reply. Tell them that the Terran Colonial Defense Force does not negotiate with terrorists, and that any being under our protection will remain so regardless of threats. Admiral, Marcus said quietly, they came here because of me, because I refused to follow an immoral order, and Veltar chose to intervene. Maybe I should— Don't even finish that thought, Sergeant. Morrison cut him off sharply. The moment we start sacrificing people to appease extremists is the moment we lose everything worth fighting for. You and Veltar represent the possibility that this war can end through understanding rather than annihilation. That's worth defending. A new alarm joined the cacophony filling the command center. Incoming transmission from the approaching fleet, the communications officer announced. They're requesting to speak directly with the human commander. Put it through, Morrison ordered. The main screen flickered to reveal a Zephyrian unlike any Marcus had seen before, where Veltar possessed an ethereal beauty that suggested wisdom and contemplation, this being radiated menace and authority. Its crystalline features were sharper, more angular, and its eyes held a cold intelligence that seemed to calculate the value of everything it observed. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed designed to inspire fear. I am War Master Thexgar of the Dominion Fleet. the alien announced. You harbor a traitor to the natural order of the galaxy. Surrender this corrupted being and the human who has been contaminated by its lies, and your deaths will be swift. Refuse, and we will demonstrate why the Dominion caste has maintained galactic order for millennia. Morrison stepped into view of the camera, her posture radiating defiance despite the overwhelming odds they faced. I am Admiral Sarah Morrison, commanding officer of TCDF forces in this sector. The beings you demand are under our protection, and they will remain so. If you want them, you'll have to go through every human on this planet. Thexkar's expression shifted to what Marcus was beginning to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of amusement. Your species continues to demonstrate the very traits that make your elimination necessary. You choose conflict over submission, chaos over order, individual will over collective harmony. These characteristics prove that humanity cannot coexist with civilized galactic society. Maybe we define civilization differently, Morrison replied coldly. We believe civilization means protecting the innocent and standing up for moral principles, even when it's difficult. If that makes us incompatible with your idea of order, so be it. Veltar stepped into view of the camera, its presence causing a visible reaction of rage from Thexkar. Honored War Master, Veltar said formally, I request a right to speak as a member of the Resonance caste. You have no rights, betrayer, Thexkar snarled. You have allied yourself with a species that represents everything destructive and chaotic in the galaxy. Your actions prove that even the Resonance caste can be corrupted by prolonged exposure to inferior thinking. Or perhaps, Veltar replied calmly, my actions prove that wisdom sometimes requires questioning established assumptions. The human beside me chose to protect innocent life rather than follow orders for massacre. If such choices represent corruption, then perhaps our definition of purity needs examination. Thexkar's image wavered as his composure cracked. You speak of protecting innocent life while standing beside the representatives of a species that will destroy countless civilizations if allowed to continue their chaotic expansion. Your sentiment blinds you to strategic necessity. Marcus found himself stepping forward before he consciously decided to speak. War Master Thexkar, with respect, you're talking about destroying an entire species based on what you think we might do in the future. That's not justice or strategic necessity. It's genocide based on prejudice. The primitive speaks, Thexkar observed with disdain. Tell me, human, what gives your species the right to develop independently of galactic oversight? What makes you believe you can ignore the wisdom accumulated over millions of years by your betters? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus realized that this was the moment that would define not just this confrontation, but possibly the future relationship between humanity and the galaxy at large. He thought about his childhood on New Eden, about the dreams that had driven humans to reach for the stars, about the simple desire to be free, to make their own choices and mistakes. Nothing gives us that right, Marcus said finally. We take that right because we believe that sentient beings should be free to determine their own destiny. Maybe we'll make mistakes. Maybe we'll develop in ways that surprise or concern you. But the alternative, having our fate decided by others who think they know better, isn't life. It's just a sophisticated form of slavery. Thexkar's expression grew even colder. And when your chaotic development threatens other species, when your independence inspires rebellion among those who should accept their place in the established order, what then? Then we deal with those problems when they arise through negotiation and cooperation, Morrison interjected, not by committing genocide to prevent possibilities that might never occur. The galaxy tried cooperation, Thexkar replied. The result was chaos, war, and the near collapse of civilization. Order was restored only when the Dominion caste took responsibility for maintaining proper development among all species. Your independence threatens to return the galaxy to that chaotic state. Veltar spoke quietly. The chaos you describe occurred millions of years ago, under conditions that no longer exist. Perhaps the time has come to trust that beings can learn from history rather than being forever constrained by it. Trust. Thexkar repeated the word as if it were a curse. Trust leads to betrayal. Order prevents betrayal. You have chosen to betray your own species in favor of aliens. just as this human has chosen to betray military discipline in favor of misguided sentiment. Both choices prove that individuals cannot be trusted to make decisions that affect entire civilizations. The philosophical debate might have continued indefinitely, but reality intervened in the form of proximity alarms screaming throughout the facility. The Zephyrian fleet had moved into attack formation, their weapons charging with energy signatures that lit up every sensor array. "This conversation is over," Thexkar announced. "You have 1 hour to surrender the traitors, or we will begin systematic destruction of all human installations on this world. After that, we will move to the Proxima Centauri system and demonstrate what happens to species that refuse to accept galactic order." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in tense silence, broken only by the continuing alerts from tactical systems. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The largest Zephyrian fleet ever assembled was preparing to attack because he had refused to murder civilians. "Admiral," he said quietly, "maybe Thexkar is right. Maybe my actions will lead to more destruction than if I had just followed orders." Morrison turned to look at him with fierce determination. "Sergeant, if we start second-guessing moral choices because they have consequences, we lose the very thing that makes us worth defending. You chose to protect innocent life. That choice might have triggered this battle, but it also opened the door to the possibility of peace. Sometimes the right choice leads to conflict, but that doesn't make it the wrong choice." Veltar placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Your actions have already had consequences you have not yet seen. Word of a human soldier refusing to commit atrocities has spread throughout the Resonance Caste and beyond. For the first time in years, there are Zephyrians openly questioning the wisdom of this war." Thexkar's aggressive response demonstrates his fear that such questions might spread. "Is there any way to contact these other Zephyrians?" Morrison asked. "If they're factions that oppose the war, maybe they can intervene." "I can try," Veltar said, moving toward the communications console. "But understand that any transmission will reveal their identities to the Dominion Caste. Simply receiving a message from me could result in their execution for treason." "Do it," Morrison said without hesitation. "If there's any chance of preventing this escalation, we have to take it." As Veltar began composing a message in harmonics that human ears could barely detect, Marcus watched the tactical displays showing the inexorable approach of the Zephyrian fleet. In less than an hour, the battle would begin, and the outcome would determine whether his choice to protect innocent life had been the first step toward peace or the catalyst for an escalation that would consume both species. "Whatever happens," he said to Morrison, "I want you to know that I don't regret my choice on that battlefield." "Neither do I," Morrison replied. "And if we survive this, history will remember that humanity chose to stand by its principles even when faced with overwhelming odds. That might be the most important victory of all." The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness as they waited to see whether Veltar's desperate gamble would reach sympathetic ears, or whether the galaxy's oldest debate, order versus freedom, would be settled once again through violence and destruction. In the distance, the Zephyrian fleet continued its approach, beautiful and terrible in its inevitability, while two species balanced on the knife's edge between understanding and annihilation.